Welcome back. So thrilled to have everyone here. As you've heard a few times, we have record numbers of engagement and attendees. And this year of all years, it's super exciting. So with that in mind, this next session, I'm personally deeply excited about it. As you can see on screen, we have Paul Daversa and Geri Allyn. And you may not know who they are, and that's because they never do media. Paul was telling me this is the first media he's done in years, and he has a no media policy. So this is a pretty rare occurrence, and we're so thrilled to have them. So with that in mind, I want to introduce them. So Paul Daversa is without a doubt the most preeminent headhunter globally in the tech space. He has look through your phone, look at the apps. He's worked with all of them. He's worked with Twitter and Snapchat and Spotify and Airbnb and Uber, and this is HBS. So I'm sure you have Robinhood on your phone. He's working with Robinhood. He did both Calm and Headspace, which is impressive in its own right. And along with Paul, we have Geri Allyn. So Geri is a partner at Daversa Partners. She is one of the youngest and highest ranking headhunters in tech today, full stop, period. And Daversa Partners, quite simply, is the #1 headhunting firm globally, working with all the tech companies, all the venture firms. So we are so thrilled to have both of you here today. Thank you so much for joining us for a session on how the heck do we build a career in tech. So with that in mind, I want to kick it off with a real softball question, a true softball question. A lot of folks here, they're coming from tech, they're looking to get their foot in tech. What's the big piece of advice? How do they do it? Where do they start?
Well, great question. First, before we answer that, you've got a career somewhere. Dan, pay attention. Pay attention. Stop looking the other way. You have a career here. First, I want to say what a pleasure and an honor it is to be here. And wow, on that introduction. Fantastic. And I am excited. And I have not done actually a media event. We do have a no media policy in probably more like a decade. We've had kind of a thesis that we'll just stay out of the media, keep our heads down, and do just fantastic work. Before I get to answer your question, though, I did watch your event earlier this morning with Mr. Wonderful. And so I do want to comment on something. The last part about you're worthless, so he and I see it completely differently. I actually think you students at HBS not only are not worthless, is probably the most valuable set of assets you could bring. And this is one of the most revolutionary times in the industry for you to be bringing your personal self. And so I'm super excited. So while I enjoy watching him on TV, there's no truth to that whatsoever. So with that in mind, you asked me a question about softball. What do we do to get into tech? And I thought about the time we had together, and if I was going to leave you with one thing, what would that one thing be? What message would I have? And that would be to master your personal narrative, mastering your story, how you tell, how you transcend your story out into the industry is probably the #1 most fundamental thing you could do to enhance and amplify your career. It's also the big failure point for most people in general. I see this out of a lot of young HBS and Stanford grads and people that have bright careers. So with that in mind, how about like when I met Dan? So let me just tell you a little bit of a story. I was in a room with Arianna Huffington, who Dan had worked for. Dan walked into the room and he came in and he sat down, and I was in the midst of a meal with Arianna, who has a strategy. I was very busy, didn't have the capacity, but she laid out a feast, fattened me up, weakened me, softened me. But then Dan walked in and I said, "Hey, Dan, what's your story? What do you do?" And he said, "Hey, here's what I do." I said, "No, what do you actually do when you come to work every day? What do you do?" And he talked to me about working with clients and his interaction with them. And it was almost instantaneously, the one thing that Dan did is he was the aha moment that every founder, CEO, and investor looks for, is a transfer of trust with humility and with integrity. And so the reason that I accepted this invite was because of that relationship, which we'll get back to. So one, master your story. Two, I would just say as an HBS alum, you have a phenomenal advantage and you have some disadvantages. The advantage side is that you are with the greatest institution on planet Earth. So congratulations. The disadvantage is that there is this assumption, an obsolete assumption, that maybe because you're HBS, you don't know how to grind, that you don't have the grit, that you don't have the staying power. And I think that becomes less of an issue as you are later on in your career. I have plenty of HBS senior executives that I'm incredibly proud of having placed. I do think one of the things you want to turn to and think about is how do you overturn that assumption that you're going to live with no matter what? I would also say I'm going to try to leave some sprinkling as we go along the way. Some of the sprinklings are going to be, I keep things in 3s and 4s. So write this down, all of you, 4 H's. These 4 H's are the characteristics that every founder, every CEO, every client, everyone I look for, and it's what I look for when I'm interviewing someone. So we'll get how do you get into tech, but here's the 4 H's. Honesty, humility, hunger, and hustle. So I think that is really, that's really the kind of core characteristics. One of the suggestions though, because I don't do these sessions very often, is telling you all of these characteristics and hoping you leave with something seems a bit trite. We'll save that for Mr. Wonderful. But I think what we should do, Dan, is why don't we just pick someone? We'll talk about what we do in terms of mastering your personal story. Why don't we pick someone randomly that you can select, have them tell the story, and then myself and Geri will do a virtual exercise of how to amplify and maybe boost that story a bit.
Sounds great. Let's do it. I think we have someone volunteering in the wing. Let's add them in here. We have Amelia Cow. Hello, Amelia. Can you hear me?
Hi, all. Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you great. Thank you so much for volunteering.
Thank you
Hi,
guys
Amelia.
for having me.
It's nice to meet you. I was gonna ask you if we'd met before, but while we were trying to get set up, we were backstage for about 7 seconds. But it's nice to meet you. I haven't met you before, and I know we haven't spoken. So I'd love to hear your story. I haven't seen your profile, but I'd love to hear your story just in general. What do you do? How do you describe what you've done? Just a riff.
Awesome. Thank you guys for having me and letting me be the guinea pig. I'll start at the beginning. I grew up in the Bay Area. I was the oldest of 3 sisters, and I moved to the East Coast for college at Georgetown, where I studied economics and Spanish, but I really spent most of my free time working at the student-run grocery store, and that's where I learned that I loved operating. I loved being part of a team and getting my hands dirty, everything from fixing refrigerators to managing and hiring a team. So after school, I wanted to continue in some sort of operational capacity, and I joined Bloomingdale's as a planner, basically setting the budget for what we could buy throughout the season and then allocating that to different stores across the country. But about 6 months into my time at Bloomingdale's, I met a guy named Ben. He had left his full-time job as an investment banker to rent out an Airbnb full-time. Ben and I became friends. I thought this was really interesting. It was before a lot of the regulations came into the space, and I decided to do that on the side. And I realized I was like much more engaged in this Airbnb sort of side hustle than I was in my day-to-day job. So after my second year at Bloomingdale's, I decided to enter that space full-time. I wound down the Airbnb and I joined Uber. I know, Paul, I have you to thank for many of the wonderful leaders that I was able to work for there. I joined on the operations team working on new driver growth in New York City, so onboarding new drivers and the processes around that. In the first year and a half there, we were able to more than double our driver base. We were doubling our trips, hitting 4 million trips a week. So it was a really fun, scrappy, exciting time. I did a short stint after that leading the regulatory operations team for the Northeast, so working with government partners, making sure we were setting up the foundations to share data with our government partners. And then in early 2019, I realized I felt kind of saturated on the rideshare business and decided to move into a strategy role on the then newly formed e-bikes and e-scooters team. So spent my last year and a half working with the leadership team there to really deeply understand that business from a financial and an operational standpoint and drive profitability. We were able to improve profitability by something like 75% in the first 9 months, and then eventually sold that business over to Lime in May of 2020, and obviously transitioned out to HBS, where I'm getting to work with Dan and continue to sort of explore the sharing economy space and future of work, and hopefully join a startup in the space after school.
Well,
That's great.
That's awesome. Well, we're gonna do a couple of things, as you mentioned a couple of lines. First of all, feedback. You're very articulate. You're thoughtful and mindful. You're clearly smart, and you're more than anything else, you're engaging. So I'm sensing early signs of both EQ and IQ. Let me just ask you a couple of questions. I'm going to switch things up. I was prepared to amplify your story, but you hit some things I wouldn't have expected. Geri happens to be a Georgetown alum. So I think I'm going to put you on the spot, Geri. I wasn't planning on going this way, but before I do, let me ask you a couple of questions. Is there a inflection point in your life, a hardship that you're willing to share with hundreds of people that are watching you right now, but something that helped change or shape your life? Could be personal or professional.
That's a great question. I mean, I think I touched on it very briefly, but I think getting exposure to this guy, Ben, and really thinking like, why am I on this traditional path? I come from, I'm half Asian, so I come from sort of a more traditional family, a more traditional path. And I remember just feeling like I was on this track, and then meeting someone who had done something radically different that really made me rethink where I was going and how many opportunities could be available to me if I was willing to sort of take the professional but also kind of social leap to say like, okay, this might not be what other people are doing, but I'm going to try it because I want to push myself. And when I did do that, I actually got a ton of support from my parents, which was exciting. And it really helped me realize that I should be sort of taking bigger risks.
Great. And might I ask what your parents do, if you're comfortable with that?
Yeah, both my parents are physicians.
Okay, great. And then big mistake. Is there a big mistake you have? Like, is something you learned from, and you'd be like, oh, I just really screwed that up?
I think one of the big mistakes was getting complacent at Bloomingdale's. I think for the second year that I was there, I knew pretty early on that it wasn't really where I wanted to be, that I wasn't learning what I wanted to learn and growing. But I got lazy. I got interested in this side business, and I let myself sit there for a long time. I remember getting to Uber and thinking I've learned more in 1 month than I learned in the last year. And I really tried going forward from there to always take on new projects, like leap for things that I didn't know if I could succeed in, but it really pushed me to not be complacent.
Okay, great. All right, Geri, I did get your text saying, I can't believe you are doing this and changing up. We had a plan and you totally screwed me. So before we do that, one other quick story. I think life is about stories, amplifying your story and your narrative. Geri did come to me many years ago and says, I have this company I want to work with. I just met this guy, Travis, and it's going to replace taxi cabs. And I told her, if you ever bring me such a stupid idea again, I'll never, you won't have a job here. And if you want to work with them, you can work with them at night moonlighting, but not on my dime. That's ridiculous. So Geri, apropos for you, why don't you take it and give some thoughts?
Yeah, well, first, Amelia, I thought your story was great. I do have one question, which is, at the end of your narrative, when you're talking about all the things you did, profitability and impact, like, what do you want to do? Like, what is the job you want? What is it that you love?
I want to be the CEO of a tech company. I want to start something myself. I loved building things from the ground up and really deeply understanding how it works on the front lines. I love working with people, and I think in the long run, I would love to run a large organization and be sort of the person setting the strategy, but also just motivating the team and really sharing the narrative, which I'm excited for you guys to help me work on.
Okay, great. Okay, so two thoughts. One is, first of all, the story that Paul just shared is a very nice characterization. To be honest, Uber was a 13-person business, and I was only 24, and I couldn't rent a car without being price gouged. So when I went to the Bay, someone told me of this. Everyone who's been to San Francisco knows, or previously, that there were it's impossible to get a cab. So I had a personal experience with the product really early on, and tried to convince him to let me work it. And then basically Ryan Graves was the CEO at the time, not even Travis. So I pitched Ryan at first in front of a table full of business cards. So, so my synthesis in your story is as follows. I think it's great. I think that the story you told is a very HBS story, which is good in the sense it's structured and it has very salient data points. But it's also the miss on it is that it doesn't have the human side. And I think the reality is in tech in particular, everyone's looking for the human story. What is it about you? Who are you? Why do you matter? Why are you a fit here? These are small companies. They're entrepreneurial. These are businesses that are, tackling Goliath on a daily basis, and they want to believe that they know the person with them sort of in this journey. And so as it relates to that, I know it's hard to figure out the balance between being balanced and professional and like coming across very poised, and then also being a human and being real. And how do you tackle and tap into that? So if I were to do your story back for you, it would be slightly similar, I'd say. So my name's Amelia, and I'm from the Bay Area. I've got 3 sisters, 2 parents who are physicians, so came from a family with very high, very linear expectations for my career. I went to Georgetown. I loved my time there. I actually spent a good amount of my time there working, which is relatively untraditional for most college students, in that I was always someone who was like passionate about problem solving. I worked at the convenience store on campus, and I worked in inventory planning and logistics and ops, and I really found myself fascinated by the usage of data-driven decision-making to solve problems, whether that was seasonal buying behavior or supply chain or sourcing. I found this passion that I had that was insights and ops blended. And then as I graduated, I went to go look at what I should do and asked around, and people kind of said, it sounds kind of like an analyst job. But I didn't want to go to banking, right? Everyone from Georgetown, there's a huge chunk of people who go into the banking and financial services sector, but it's so sterile and so far away from the consumer. And I just thought I wanted to do something that had impact, that I could see and grow and touch. And so an opportunity presented itself at Bloomingdale's, which, one of the largest retailers in the United States. They're one of the more forward-thinking retailers in the sense that they had early adopters of e-commerce, and they offered me a job as an analyst, a planning analyst. High volume, high SKU count, lots of really big, meaty problems to solve. And in the early innings, I thought it was great. But like all things in life, you got to get in under the hood and realize where the value is. And what I came to realize pretty quickly was that it was a really big, very corporate company. I found myself getting complacent. I found myself sort of slightly bored. In my free time, I had partnered with a guy who was doing an Airbnb rental, and I loved it. I mean, it was very scrappy and entrepreneurial, and I knew my parents would hate the concept that I would go into this like one-off tech ecosystem, but I was infatuated with the challenge. And when an opportunity arose at Uber, I took it. And that was, let's say, 3.5, 4 years ago. And while Uber might be $100 billion business today and a public company, at that time, Travis was the CEO. They had a squeaky clean reputation. I mean, he was a difficult personality, but certainly not as salacious as it got to, and certainly didn't have all the various modalities at the time. And over my journey there, I found that a couple of things. One, I love growth companies. I love the idea that you can be in a business that constantly is evolving. Uber could be anything, right? It's the notion of solving problems via on-demand and logistics and operational challenges. I loved that I learned about data and insights. I loved that I learned about compliance. No 2 years were the same. No 2 problems were the same. Every challenge was new and fresh, and I found myself raising my hand. Over my time there, I had 4 different jobs, culminating in the mobility business, working for Rachel Holt, who's one of the longest standing executives at Uber. She was a complete cultural beacon, a female operator that I could learn from. And I think it also helped power me to go to business school, to learn that if I want to be an operator, that I got to hone these skills and round out my experience set. That's a rough shot.
Damn, Geri, you're good.
Well done. I don't know if you can see the chat, Geri, but people are applauding you right now.
I can't see.
Geri is good. You guys are being called some very positive names here.
Yeah.
And I'd say, by the way, Amelia, I also understand as a female, especially when you're younger, even as Paul was mentioning, tech is a young person's game in a lot of capacities, but it is and it isn't. In some circles it is, but in some circles not so much, especially when it comes to financing and investors and boards, right? They want someone who feels like they write a big check, they want confidence there. So I think it's more of a presence of feeling comfortable in the room. People want to feel like you're comfortable enough to be there. and that they're having a real authentic conversation with you as a human, as opposed to feeling like it feels like an interview.
That's really helpful. I'm not sure if you all have more for Amelia. If not, we can pick up that conversation and keep running with it.
No, but you should, my advice to Amelia, get this recording, take Geri's narrative, mesh it together. I think she placed, did she place Rachel?
Yeah.
She placed Rachel there. So I think there's some themes that are in here. One, the grit, also the personal component. I think the stitching together the narrative, that there's a path, that when you look in the rearview mirror, you're connecting the dots, that this makes sense. And then I think also, like what Geri did is like, listen, I didn't know. Like, I probably pissed my parents off. They probably wanted me to be a doctor. Like, here's the path. I think that human side of it gets very underestimated in terms of the hiring competencies. So one more, I'm going to tell a quick story. I was doing the CFO search for this guy named Jack Dorsey at Square. You guys may have heard of it. This was a search where he really wanted to have in every function, he wanted someone that had a product-esque elegance and an affinity for product orientation. So when we met, I was like, Jack, even the CFO? He's like, yeah, even the CFO. I want my entire company to be filled with the appreciation for product. This search took longer than we had expected, and it drew the who's who of Silicon Valley, and frankly, the who's who of the world at that time, even though it was not the $100+ billion company it is today. I met someone fatigued in this search, a very last call. I met someone in that a morning cup of coffee before I was heading back from San Francisco to the East Coast. And I really, really liked this person, but I was looking for the grit and the grind. This person was all banking. They had no sitting CFO experience. It's going to be a total long shot. I was going to have to convince the board, but I really, really liked this person. And so I leaned over to this person and I said, hey, listen, I just got to be honest with you. I got to get to the airport, but I can't tell how tough you are. And I'm not going to figure it out. So I'm just going to ask you, give me something. How tough are you? Tell me something I wouldn't know. This 36 or 37-year-old, very well put together, very poised woman leaned forward to me and said, hey, so I grew up in Ireland, and on Wednesdays with my large family, my dad would take me out every Wednesday and we would shear the sheep. Do you know what it takes to tackle a sheep, hold it down and shear it? And I just was like, oh my God. I called up Jack. I'm like, Jack, we have our CFO. And he's like, why? I'm like, she shears sheep. Who does that? Any event, it's a very near and dear friend, a fantastic woman, a luminary in the industry. She's now the CEO of Nextdoor. Her name is Sarah Fryer. But all kidding aside, those decisions get made on all the little things.
Great. That was a really helpful story. I think we all have to learn how to shear sheep, though. Amelia, thank you so much for volunteering.
Thank you so much.
You should do that. I'm going to pull one thing from the chat. I think I learned more about interviewing in 2 minutes than in my entire life. I think that speaks a lot to what we all just experienced. So to go off of some of those themes, we've talked about some characteristics that matter. We've talked about authenticity. We've talked about being tough and grit. What other characteristics are you looking for when you're recruiting someone? And especially knowing that a lot of us here are millennials or even younger. We're looking to rise into leadership positions in the next few years. I'm sure you're already speaking with millennials for top positions. Do you see anything different about the newer generation, the characteristics that are important to them, how recruiters are considering them? What advice do you have for us in this generation?
I will chime in quickly because I know Paul's theory on this thing, and his is relatively longer than mine. I generally think that the biggest attributes that you can think about when you go to these meetings, or even think about in your life, is number one is curiosity, and I liken that really to humility. But it's this notion of your ability to learn from anyone. This holier than thou attitude of I've arrived, I have my MBA, I've been doing something for a while, thereby am incapable of evolutionary thought, right? There's nothing else to be learned. The reality is, especially as it relates to tech, it is a constant evolution, right? It's a fluid ecosystem. No 2 days are the same, no 2 moments are the same. Tech is constantly reinventing itself. So this idea that you are genuinely curious, you want to learn, you want to know more, you want to ask questions, and that you're okay to ask those questions to anyone. Someone who's younger than you or older than you or a peer set, someone from a different company. It's this nature that makes you better by feeling like you are formulating a well-rounded opinion. And the second one is this notion of fearlessness. We were talking about it earlier about me being bold enough to cold email Ryan and Travis when I'd been at Daversa 10 months, trying to say like, hey, I should build your leadership team. Looking back on that, I even spelled 2 of our clients' names wrong in it. It was like a horribly written email, but I did it and I kept following up and I really believed in it. And I was fearless. Like I took on a project I had no business doing in my free time, which was already pretty limited. And I wanted it. I believed in the company and I was not afraid to fail. And especially as it relates to tech, you just can't be afraid to fail. You can't be afraid to try something for the first time. As it relates to Amelia's commentary about wanting to be a CEO, I always say to clients when we're doing CEO searches, they'd say, well, we want someone with CEO experience. And I say every CEO was a first-time CEO at one point. No one was ever just always a CEO. Everyone was a rising star. Everyone had an inflection point, which meant at one moment in time, you were doing a job you'd never done before. And that is scary. So the reality is being able to be fearless and, again, ask questions so you can, create your arsenal for success, but be fearless enough to bet on yourself and step into those roles and know that you might fail, but know that that failure doesn't define you. It makes you better. That's the most important thing. And Paul loves to talk about inflection points, and that's it, right? The things that you do, the big misses, the mistakes you've made, how that colors your future, the learnings, like we love that. We love people who have failed beautifully. It's awesome. Like I'm talking car crash level professional failures, because you learn those mistakes and you never forget them. And you're better for that. Okay. Sorry, Paul. I know where you're going with this too.
No. I think you said it well. I'm going to go in a different direction. I'm going to add something that I learned from Jack Welch. When I first started my firm, I was 27 years old. It was a firm of me, a desk and a phone. I had a great opportunity to work with, at that time, what was one of the greatest CEOs of all time. And in the late 90s, when the internet bubble was coming, Jack had a thesis of how he would evaluate candidates. I'm sharing this with you because it doesn't get old. Gen Z, Gen X, millennial. One of the questions would be like, how do I get better at this? How do I crack in? What should I look for? What do others look for? I still prep all of my candidates, my CEOs, my CFOs, my COOs, head of products. All of those people I prep with the same notion. I'm going to give you another. I gave you my 4 H's. I'm going to give you what is originally Jack Welch's 4 E's. These 4 E's don't get old. They're 25 years old. I still to this day tell people to think about them. I would go to Jack and he'd say, hey, listen, we're going to look at candidates. They're going to have these 4 E's. If they miss an E, they're out. So I'd go to Jack and I'd say, great. And here's the 4 E's. Energy. Energize others. Edge. And execution. So I would send someone like Dan to Jack and I'd be like, oh my God, you got to wait till you meet Dan. You're going to love Dan. Jack would come back and he's kind of crusty and be like, oh my God, like guy's got energy, definitely can lead people and energize others. He's got edge, but the kid hasn't executed a goddamn thing. He's out. And I'd go back and I'd be like, Jack, I got this other kid. I got Geri. I'd be like, oh my God, Geri's an execution machine. And she's definitely edgy, but she's got no energy and she ain't energizing anyone. She's out. And so I would tell you to think about those 4 E's every meeting you take. Every opportunity you take, every meeting is a chance for you to transfer this sense of confidence. You only have a minute or two when you meet someone to make an impression. So that's one. The second one is a completely different direction. My 28 years of doing this, I'm going to boil this all down to the Wizard of Oz theory. You know the Wizard of Oz, Dan?
I know the movie. Tell me the theory. Right.
So here's the deal. And this is true of all freshly minted grads that are ready to go change the world. I think you all already have what the scarecrow's looking for. And most of them have what the Tin Man needs. But most lack what the lion's looking for. And so I'm back to what Geri talked about. Like the most important thing is courage. Like it is hard in this and these tech companies. And it's not a path of, it's the path of least resistance that most people take. And I think in this world, you want to take the path of most resistance, the things that scare the crap out of you. And those mistakes, anytime we're interviewing senior executives, the really, really high quality ones, you ask them about the 3 most important or banes of pride of the most meaningful impact that they've made, and the really good ones to say, let me tell you the 2 or 3 things I screwed up in my life that I would never do again, but I learned the most. And so back to putting an explanation point on what Geri talked about, I would say that, you're making mistakes on someone else's dime is what other companies are going to pay for. So bring that to your meetings and your interviews and your story to amplify it.
How do you bring that courage before the meeting? In other words, how do you get on someone's radar as someone that has grit and courage, on paper?
Yeah, great question. So the first part of courage is not to overthink it. Geri will make this way more articulate, but the reality of it is like this world, particularly this millennial world and Gen Z and Gen X, when you ask, like, did you talk to Dan? It's like, yeah, I talked to him. It's like, no, you didn't talk to him. You text him. So the first thing is, like, send an email and don't send a novel. I'm not reading your novels. We don't read them. But send an email that says, do you have a minute? Or Reid Hoffman suggested, I saw on HBS. I know you're connected to Reid Hoffman. Or I watched your session. Would you make a minute for me? The reality of it is that most high quality people in this industry, when there's some connection, we actually will make the minute. And that's the crack in the door. I think you have to go for the jugular. You have to pick up the phone. You have to be aggressive. You also have to have your narrative. You have to ask for help. Would you be willing to help me? Here's my story. Would you listen to my story? Do you know anyone? Don't get off the phone without asking, would you be willing to help me? Would you take another call with me? And if there's a failure point anywhere or a bane of frustration with such high influence, and particularly with a group that I think has the most opportunity in the 3 generations that in the decades I've been doing this, I think there's more opportunity here than ever before. And then I think, Geri, you can talk about the network, like tapping into that network.
Yeah, I don't know, Dan, how much more time we have, but just the other little point on what Paul was saying about this that I think is important about your story, which we didn't really talk about, but I think is important for everyone in this group, is you need a more than one version of your story. It sounds kind of silly when I say it this way, but you got to understand the rooms you're entering in when you're in those rooms. So in our world, when we think about HBS, the biggest pushback we get on candidates from HBS or Harvard or really any like high quality, let's say top tier school, is they're obviously very smart and they seem like a great strategist, but what did they actually do? And you, in terms of like, hey, let me give you a call out that you should be aware of. That's a call out, because the reason that candidates get DQ'd off of these searches or don't get the job is that they're not articulate enough with like, the thing that they're amazing at. What is their superpower? Like what is your spike? So yes, I have a background in finance, but I'm a rock star in FP&A. Or when it comes to marketing, I like marketing in broad base, but I really am passionate about performance marketing or programmatic or product marketing. But like know what your spike is and then speak to the broader perspective, but at least be able to articulate that. And then knowing the room you're in, you can make pivots to that. But just know that your audience wants to hear that. And then as it relates to what Paul was saying about raising your hand, the biggest piece of advice Paul will always say is like, pick up the phone. Do not email. Do not call people. Pick up the phone. Someone wants to know that you're there and that you care enough to take the time and energy to call. And then when you do, know what you're asking for. Like, there's actually a great HBS book that talks a little bit about like the monkey on your back, right? Like don't put the monkey on someone else's back, right? Like if you have an ask, tell them exactly what they need to do to deliver to you, and then make it an easy solve for them, right? This whole like hallway chatter, you're never going to get a result. And empower your networks. It seems super obvious, but even on this, like you guys have an incredible, like top 2 alumni networks in Harvard. It's like Harvard and McKinsey. Leverage that network. Look at companies that you love and find people who have worked where you've worked, are from your hometown, went to your college, went to your high school. Go to your parents and your parents' friends and your neighbors and your high school friends and their parents and ask them what they do and who they know and would they be comfortable. Everyone wants to, the biggest risk in any company, this isn't just tech, is the unknown and uncertainty, right? Like that's why interview processes are so long, is to try to get to know someone before they join your company. So triangulating into those relationships through a warm intro, someone who might even just tangentially know you, but someone in that circle can vouch that this is a high quality person, really good moral fiber, really hard worker. Like, you immediately have a step up, an open door, even if it's just a crack. And that's all you need if you're smart. If you're smart enough, all you need is a little crack in the door. You can slip yourself in and you can win the day yourself. And I think people often feel like it's unfavorable to raise their hand and ask for help or to put people out. But the reality is, like, that's how business is built. It's built on relationships. So don't be afraid to call that network, to comb that network, to build that network, and to activate that network.
Thank you, Geri, for that advice. I think everyone will appreciate it. We are running out of time. Any final words of wisdom from Paul and Geri?
I'm going to leave, I'm going to put an explanation point on this. I think this is probably the greatest point for your generation. I'm going to give you some advice. We are in a revolution that I don't think we've seen in 2 decades. 5G is the underbelly that's going to amplify, accelerate, and serve as a shot of steroid in everything that we do. We're 3-4 years to the mid 2020s. We're talking about robotic spaceships, hotels that are in space. We're talking about AI and ML built in. The one recommendation I would make for you, because I'm super optimistic about this generation, is I think you actually have already solved for one of the big uncertainties, which is, are you gritty? Are you tough? I would encourage you to talk to people about the one thing that your generation will have that others will probably never be able to articulate, is that you were gritty enough to survive a global pandemic. And if there's ever a test to grit and emotional strength and courage, that's it. Dan, I want to thank you for the opportunity we had today. It was great seeing you. By the way, last piece, you don't know until you ask. You asked for us to come here. And without doing that, you just never know as well. But I'm super optimistic for what the future holds for this group.
Well, thank you so much, Paul and Geri. Thank you for saying yes and breaking your new media policy. This was a fantastic conversation. So we're so grateful here at HBS Tech and in the broader HBS community. Thank you so much. We are going to transition now into our next event.
Thanks, Dan.
Take care.
Take care now.
Talk to you soon.